Thank you, Vivian. So Rick did end on a positive note when he was talking about how if we're going to cure HIV infection, it's likely going to require a combination approach. And so I'm going to basically outline in my presentation here, essentially, why we're actually pursuing this agenda, and how we are in the clinic going about trying to develop a testable combination approach to achieve either a cure or remission. But let me just sort of start off with some big picture perspectives. I know you've had some cure overviews already, but I just want to sort of hone in on a question which the field is always taken for granted, but I don't think we've ever really answered as a field. And that is, why do we actually need a cure? Right? I mean, there are a lot of people out there who wonder this and who basically push back against the cure agenda, primarily because treatment works great, and it's getting better, and prevention also works pretty good and might getting better. And so I sort of want to discuss that a little bit in the first part of my talk, and then I'm going to essentially outline what I believe is the most viable pathway right now to achieving cure, and what our group is doing to make progress in this arena. All right, so let's start with the basics. Because of the effective treatment and prevention, why exactly are we doing this? And I'll say right up front that the reason why this question needs to be addressed sooner than later is because if you try to figure out what impact you want to have, what defect in the treatment landscape you're trying to fix, well, that has a huge impact on what type of product you're going to develop, and what I think we should be working on in the clinic as we speak. So, why do we need a cure? There are two broad perspectives. First, of course, the patient. There's been a couple of surveys done of HIV-infected people, people who've actually generally been doing well in treatment. They've been asked, why do you want a cure? And basically, sure, why not? And what is it about a cure that you actually think is going to be most important? Now, I thought it was going to be side effects from the drugs, treatment fatigue, all the comorbidity story that people were concerned about and so forth, but no. A very consistent message has come back from people with HIV doing well on therapy, a big if, is that stigma. Stigma is it's a major issue for people with HIV. It is a daily issue. It basically wears people out, and they basically want to get rid of the virus, not because they necessarily want to get rid of the drugs, but because they want to get rid of the stigma. And anytime someone in the media comes out basically saying they're HIV positive, that is basically a big issue of the response. People are shocked. People are worried that people are going to be ostracized. People talk about how they've been basically hiding in the closet and so forth. So, stigma is a big problem even for people on treatment. The other issue, this one gets a bit more complicated, is the concept that, that even in the context of treatment, there's ongoing issues from either the virus being produced or the virus replicating. And then Tim Shacker is going to talk next, and he'll get into some of those nuances. In fact, this is work from Tim, Tim's group in collaboration with us. And what this story says, it's kind of complicated, but we sent a bunch of biopsy tissues from San Francisco to Tim Shacker's lab in Minnesota. He was blinded, and he looked at two things in these mucosal tissues. He looked at how much collagen was there, how much fibrosis, and what the CD4 density was. And basically found that everybody with HIV, whether they were untreated or elite controllers or on long-term ART or whatever, basically had evidence of residual, presumably irreversible damage to the mucosa with collagen deposition, fibrosis, and a lack of CD4 density. Mixed into that study was the Berlin patient, who we believe is cured. And I'll come back to that in a second. And he was remarkably similar, and Tim can confirm, he looked more like the HIV negative person than the person on long-term therapy, implying that the virus that exists during long-term therapy is causing some damage that the cure basically reversed. So that's a reason to pursue a cure in terms of improving the health of people, because having that chronic virus reservoir, in theory, might be detrimental to your health. So therefore, if this is why we're going to basically do this, then we need to get rid of all the virus. And that is essentially how we define now cure. So the word cure basically refers to complete and total removal of all replication competent HIV. It's obviously what we want to do. A lot of people, including myself, thinks that short of gene therapy and cell-based therapy, it's probably not going to be possible. And we actually, this paper here on the bottom, even if you think you cured someone, proving a negative can be is basically impossible. We've been trying for 4 or 5 years to prove that Timothy Brown, the Berlin patient, has been truly cured. And we always get these hints that the virus is there. Again, proving a cure is going to be a challenge and just part of a number of barriers in pursuing this particular outcome. Now, I think the money that is flowing into HIV cure has less to do with the individual needs and more to do with the public health needs. And here we get into, I think, what's probably, for me, the reason why I'm in this business. If you look globally at what's happening with treatment, right, it's been amazing over the past 10 to 15 years with all this global investment, the uptake of antiretroviral therapy around the world. And we basically have gotten a lot of people tested, and a lot of people tested. We've got a lot of those people into care, and we've gotten a lot of those people onto treatment, and they're doing well. But when you actually look at the numbers, right, from these cascade, and this was from 2016, at the end of the day, despite this global investment, which is not likely to grow, only about half of the patients, maybe even less, at any point in time are suppressed. Now, there are definitely regions of the world where we've gotten much closer to 90-90-90. And my thing in the back of my mind, and here I am now talking as a doc, I have a bunch of patients that I follow since 93, in fact, yes, indeed, 93, when I started. The thing that I actually have always found to be the problem is not getting them on therapy, is keeping them on therapy. And there are some studies that are coming out that basically say, yeah, you can bring people in and get them on therapy, but can you maintain them on therapy and suppressed year in and year out? Now, we have people in our clinic that have been suppressed for 20 years, but they're rare, right? Most people, for whatever reason, essentially run into problems in the United States. When Obamacare sort of popped up on the scene, it caused all sorts of chaos. A lot of people lost their insurance. There were a lot of breaks, and now that Obamacare is sort of being dismantled, we're seeing the same thing. So healthcare is a problem. A lot of people with HIV have mental health disorders, a lot of substance abuse, mid-age crisis, whatever. A lot of things happen that basically. So this, to me, is the fundamental problem with treatment. It just is hard for a lot of people to stay on therapy. If you acquire HIV in your 20s, you're going to have to maintain on therapy, whether injectables or not, for 50, 60, 70 years. And that, to me, is basically the primary thing that we need to fix with the cure. In San Francisco, and this actually has public health implications. In San Francisco, we have this massive investment in getting to zero, right? We have, and only San Francisco can do this because we have an engaged community. We have a Department of Public Health that will do anything it can for the HIV epidemic. Everybody in the city works very well together, academia, industry, community, public health. And we have been quite successful. In our city, in my clinic, the standard of care is if you show up untreated, you are not to leave that room unless you're on therapy. We treat everybody. And we treat everybody basically immediately. And we've done quite well, but even in that context, we've only dropped transmission rates by about 50% over the past few years. So if you buy into that argument, the public health argument, for a reason why we do this, then you don't need a cure. You just need to get the virus down below a level that maintains health and prevents transmission. And this, I think, is going to be more achievable. And I think it's going to be more achievable because basically we see this fair amount, right? Elite controllers do this. Post-treatment controllers do this. We're not curing people, but we're basically achieving what might be called a long-term remission. Now, our group has spent the last 10 years studying elite controllers, and we have been arguing that elite control is not a benign situation. There is chronic inflammation, there's heart disease, and we generally treat our elite controllers. So why do I want to take away treat to make an elite controller? Well, again, it's because this curative interventions are for the people who cannot stay on therapy. And also, there is a fascinating group of people that we're characterizing, and other people are characterizing, that have been referred to not as more as exceptional elite controllers. These are people who basically essentially look close to normal, have very little virus, have no chronic inflammation, and so forth. And so that's kind of the model that we're pursuing in the work I'm about to describe. All right. If you buy in the concept that the public health issue is the key driver for the cure agenda, then you have to ask your question, well, what will have an impact? Right? What will have an impact in a landscape 10 years from now when there will be injectables, there will be a vaccine, there will be various different ways of PrEP? And this basically was an exercise that the Gates Foundation asked a bunch of us to do. And essentially, and this is just a first step, this needs to be nuanced, but we need to develop something that's going to be extremely effective, that's comparable to art, that's going to be safe, that can be administered basically anywhere, that will work in people on therapy regardless of the CD4 count or the region or subtype, and importantly, is going to be given in a short period of time, not require excess monitoring, and not be too expensive. So that is the goal, I believe, to have the most impactful intervention on a global level. Okay, so that's why I think we should be doing this, why we should be having this debate. So how we actually going to get there? I'm not really going to go into much of this in any detail at all. There are 5 major approaches. There's gene and cell-based therapy. No doubt in my mind, if you force me to cure a person, the best way to do that is through the various different ways that are being done with gene therapy as we speak. The Berlin patient being the classic example. There's shock and kill. There's block and lock, which you've heard about, I think, already here at the meeting. And then there's the 2 things I'm going to talk about, starting therapy early and achieving remission. Now, early art. Early art, in our Getting to Zero approach in San Francisco, we're getting a lot of people into care on treatment pretty early these days. So it's actually working. But is it going to be curative? Here is an example of what I think is probably the earliest treated adult that's been reported. This is a gentleman who was being followed in that San Francisco network. He had very sexually active, had multiple partners, decided to go on PrEP. He came into a PrEP study, it was on a Wednesday, HIV negative, told to come back on Monday to start PrEP. He came back on Monday, he started PrEP, his viral load was like 51 on that day. Basically that's day 1, Phoebic 1. He started Truvada, which suppressed the virus, kept it down at bay, took 3 or 4 days, I think, and then we got him on antiretroviral therapy. And we spent a lot of time proving to ourselves that he actually was infected, and we did. And then we kept him on therapy for 2 years. And we put him through the machine. And he was very generous with his body. And the IRB was relatively liberal and allowed us to do things that were a bit edgy because we wanted to learn. Did he have any virus, right? So we did multiple lymph nodes. He actually had a lumbar puncture. He had a colonoscopy and a ileal biopsies. He had a couple sigmoidoscopies. He had a bunch of leukapheresis. Everything was basically negative after the first few weeks. We thought his antibody level was negative. His T-cell count was normal. Everything looked great. I thought he was cured myself. And he got fed up with us talking about this. And he just said, well, you just, come on, guys, let's just stop drugs. And we were all nervous about it. And he came in after Christmas and said, if you don't stop these drugs, I'm stopping tomorrow. And so I said, all right, hold on, give us 2 weeks. We got an IRB approval in a couple of weeks. He stopped therapy. And then he came in every week. Every week. He went to Disney World, and where he had to go to a lab at the Disney World. There's a lab at Disney World for HIV testing. He found it. And it was negative. And during this period of time, it was kind of a unique experience, I got to tell you. Because we were all worried that this virus was going to explode Because, he had no existing HIV-specific responses. So he had no protection. If that virus came up, it was going to shoot up high. And he got a little tired of all the monitoring. And he actually, I think, got a little tired of wondering himself, is he infected? And it had an impact on his sex life, and that's a whole different discussion. And then after Thanksgiving, he came in 9 months later, and he did not look well. And the previous viral load, I think, had been just detected. And so I said, you. And so we started therapy without a confirmation in the clinic that day. In fact, in the room, he went back on therapy. Turned out in retrospect that he was in fact infected. The virus was rebounding when we saw him that day. Probably rebounded because he had some kind of flu, because he wasn't sick from the HIV rebound. At the time, his virus was only a few thousand. But I suspect some influenza or something basically kicked the virus out of some hiding place, and there you go. Bottom line is, two things. I don't think we're going to cure people with HIV. And second, we need a better way to do these studies. And so I actually think one of the most important things in the cure agenda is for the assay people to develop these assays that will allow people to test themselves wherever they are for whatever reason. Basically, at home, point of care, at home, basically probably a pinprick testing of viral loads so that people sort of know if you're on antiretroviral drugs and you took those drugs that morning, you can assume you don't have virus in your body. If you're cured and you don't really know you're cured, you never know. And so I think this is one of the great unmet needs. Okay. The other thing that deserves comment about early ART is this concept of post-treatment control. Now, the story of the post-treatment control phenomenon is kind of complicated. This was reported by the French about, 5 years ago. No one believed it. No one believed that this was real. Everyone thought that these people in Paris were elite controllers who got treated by mistake. But it has turned out, and I was one of these that was dubious about the whole story, but it's turned out that this phenomenon, that treatment, particularly early, alters the relationship between the virus and the host in a permanent way. I think most people now believe is real. So we now know, actually, we basically now are sort of quote-unquote curing people, taking them from typical progressors to making them elite controllers with antiretroviral drugs. And that's a phenomenally important story. And I think everyone in this business needs to start collecting these individuals so we can learn what's going on. When you look deep down into the post-treatment controllers, they look more like those exceptional elite controllers, if you're following my story. But they really have low levels of T-cell activation, and the reservoir sizes are quite tiny, and they actually sometimes decline over time. And so this is a really important arena for research. Our group is trying to accumulate these individuals. We actually ended up I told everybody that we had no post-treatment controllers in San Francisco. And then I went back and I looked at how we defined our elite controllers 10 years ago. And we defined them about anyone whose virus was undetectable, whether they had gotten treatment before or not. Turns out actually a lot of these people had treatment before. So who knows? So we're trying to untangle to what extent we've been following these people in our clinics without really knowing it. Okay, HIV remission. All right, I think the most viable pathway to achieving ART-free control of the virus is by trying to achieve a remission with combination therapy. All right, and I think this because we have these models, and also because there is a massive amount of progress being made outside of HIV in terms of how you can manipulate the immune system to make the immune system work better. And so what are we doing in San Francisco? Well, first of all models of SIV and HIV, basically the elite controller model, the post-treatment controller model, some of the monkey work, suggest that to achieve this state, you need a low reservoir size. You need pretty low inflammation. Doesn't have to be normal, but it has to be low. And you have to presumably have a sustained host response. Most people assume CD8 T cells. that target a vulnerable part of the virus and reside and work in those regions of the body where the virus lives. That's what you need. That's what, very similar to what actually cancer immunotherapists are doing in terms of trying to figure out how to cure cancer. Now, we have been doing this for 25 years. Mike Letterman in the office and Alan Landay, we were basically going back over the last 30 years of trying to sort of, last night in the bar, try to figure out, all the studies that we've done that did absolutely nothing. And it's true. There have been dozens and dozens of vaccine studies and other studies that really have essentially done nothing worthwhile. We can generate T-cell responses with vaccines. We can reduce inflammation, but we've really never actually had any good clinical outcome in any of these studies. Why is that? Well, all right, so why have therapeutic vaccines failed? Number one, and this is some work that Bob Silicano did, but he showed that during early HIV infection over the first couple months, CTL escape is generated, and it's deposited in the reservoir, and it persists indefinitely. Okay, so then you basically, when the immune system interacts with the virus during infection, escape occurs, just like with drugs. It gets deposited, just like with drugs, and it doesn't go away. Problem number one. Problem number two. If you look at, and actually Rick Kalp's group had a really nice paper on this in JID several years ago, but I'd prefer to show mine. But his was better. When you actually look at HIV-specific T cells from blood, they, compared to at least elite controllers, often express markers of immune dysfunction, PD-1, and so forth. Okay? So the T cells that you have are targeting areas that escaped, and they don't function. And then, of course, and I think this is hugely important, treated HIV infection is a state of chronic persistent inflammation. And we've been looking at this in multiple ways over the past couple decades. If you're untreated, you got all sorts of badness going on. If you go on treatment, it all gets better, but it doesn't normalize. And a chronic inflammatory environment sets up a situation in which you have a strong counter-regulatory immunosuppressive response that basically dampens the capacity of the immune system to function normally. It's a concept that we're pursuing in the clinic, and it's one that the cancer immunotherapists are also pursuing. And then you have something that a bunch of groups have worked on, including Rick's group, but this is some data from Lewis Picker. This whole concept that there's this sanctuary, the germinal center, where all those B cells do all that B cell business, where they live, surrounded by the CD4 positive T follicular helper cells. For some reason, CD8 T cells are not invited to that party, and so the virus replicates at will in that sanctuary. And if we can't get effectors in there, we're not going to cure anyone. So we are working on all this stuff. The last one, the follicle stuff, we're only working on that in monkeys. But the rest of the stuff, we are full bore trying to fix each one of these things in people, in the clinic, as are others. And my worldview, and what our program is pursuing, is the concept that first you've got to generate T-cell responses that either work really well or target the right area of the virus. And we have actually a pretty robust program right now. In monkeys, with Lewis Picker, we're doing most of the stuff here, as well as RNA vaccine work, trying to figure out what the best way to generate T-cell responses to HIV during established infection. We're about to start a clinical trial of a DNA vaccine that was developed by Inovio that I found quite compelling because that approach has worked quite well in HPV. We are working with the NCI on a DNA vaccine that targets conserved elements. We're working with a company in Spain that has a different approach, and we're working with the CMV vaccine. This is all in people now, or hopefully soon. The last one I want to talk about a little bit in detail. So this is the very famous, iconic figure from Louis Picker and team, where he showed that if you give uninfected monkeys a CMV vaccine that has an SIV immunogen, because of the remarkable capacity of CMV to do all sorts of funny things to the immune system, you generate massive amount of SIV-specific T cells. Those monkeys are then infected. They all get infected. The vaccine does not prevent infection. But then in study after study after study, half of those monkeys that become infected, they have a blip in viremia. It goes up to, actually, we never knew how, I guess it goes up to a few thousand at least. And then it comes down, and then over a period of months, it goes away, and they're cured. No ART. That's in half of the monkeys. The other half of the monkeys, they get infected, and the typical progression occurs. 50% cure rate is not bad. So we were like, let's do this in people with HIV. And to get ready to do that, the Picker group showed that this vaccine is very immunogenic in treated SIV. So a CMV vaccine with SIV immunogens can generate good responses in treated SIV. But unfortunately, when they looked at what happened in terms of time to rebound, the vaccine had no effect, a total failure, which basically caused us all sorts of headaches because we had a $25 million grant to move this into people. And part of my SAB is here, and they're helping us figure out how to move forward. But this is fine. We got a lot of backup plans, as I mentioned. But the question the field has struggled with is why did the CMV vaccine work half the time and not the other half the time? And there's this beautiful study. I don't understand it, but it just seems beautiful. And I assume this is the right heat map, but you never know. So this guy named Michael Gale did this, one of those deep dive omics kind of thing, RNA-seq or something. What is it? It's RNA-seq, yes. Looked at what was generated by the CMV vaccine before they became infected. And on the day of the vaccination, the animals that cured their virus versus not, no difference. But on the day 3, they split. And there is this signature that has all sorts of pathways in it, including things that we can target, IL-10, TLR4, IDO, a bunch of different pathways that one can target. But anyway, we have insights into what the immune system needs to look like when SIV shows up for T cells to be curative. And I think that's a profoundly important advance. And hopefully, when we can untangle all this stuff and figure ways to enhance any vaccine to make it work better. So I think this was one of the most important studies at CROI, even though I don't really understand it. Okay, so that's problem number 1. We have all these vaccines generate T cells. We got to make them better. Okay, well, Dan Baruch had this beautiful study published a couple years in Nature where he showed that monkeys, treated monkeys, you give them a vaccine, it works okay. Give them a TLR7 agonist that stimulates T cell responses, it worked okay. Give them both, and you alter the natural history of what happens when monkeys on ART stop their therapy. So this is one of the first real good monkey studies showing that combination approaches of a therapy vaccine and a TLR7 agonist can actually make the immune system work better, and you can not cure the monkeys, but perhaps achieve a remission. We're working in the clinic now. We're working with this same drug with Gilead. We designed this study where we took people who are on long-term, who were previously partial controllers, had low viral loads, but not elite controllers for complicated reasons. They're on ART. and we're giving them the TLR7, and we're about to finish enrollment, and they're all stopping therapy, and so we're going to try to figure out whether TLR7 by itself in a person who's got a good immune system, these partial controllers from before, might work. And so these studies are ongoing. There are a number of other studies in the clinic. I'm not going to go into detail. I'll come back to this in a few minutes. Looking at TLR9 as a way to enhance CD T cell responses, NK cell responses, and perhaps even reverse latency. Okay. Persistent immune dysfunction. Our group is definitely of the mindset, and I'm sure Esper and his team would agree, and Drs. Letterman, Landay, and others in the room have been basically working on this riddle forever. We do believe that this is going to be a problem in terms of making our vaccines work better, and so we have a pretty big program right now as well. We're looking at blocking PD-1, blocking CTLA-4 in HIV-infected people with cancer to see if the immune system gets better. We have a couple studies that we've completed looking at whether blocking mTOR, which actually can reduce T-cell activation, reduces PD-1 expression, might actually is safe and potentially could be used in combination approaches. We're quite intrigued by a lot of work that's going on with IL-1 beta. We have a pilot study looking at that as well, and so forth. Most of these studies are being done right now in the ACTG. All of them, from my perspective, are being done to see if the chronic immune dysfunction can be enhanced in a safe way so that we can bring them back in combination with some of these therapeutic vaccines in the long run. All right. Combination therapy. All right. This is what Dr. Kalp said. He's basically got up here on the stage and said, if we're going to do this, we're going to do it in a combination approach. And it's probably the first time the two of us ever agreed on anything. And that's good. And here's how we're doing it. And Dr. Kalp and his team at VRC are going to help us. All right. One thing I haven't talked about that everyone has been talking about today is antibodies. All right. So this is a really important study that was presented at CROI by Dan Baruch again. And I'll go through this carefully. So they took monkeys, infected them with HIV, gave them really powerful, potent ART on day 7, kept them on ART for 2 years. So that's remarkable in itself. Okay, that's never been done. That's a pretty cool experiment. Long-term ART. Then they either got sham, they got that TLR7 agonist from Gilead, they got PGT121, which targets, is it V3 or V2? 3. Got it right. Okay, so they target V3, and that's probably good. Or the combination. And they released and this is really important. During ART, before the release, the antibodies by themselves look like they may have cured a few of those monkeys, but the antibodies plus the TR7 essentially got that reservoir so it was no longer detected. So they stopped therapy and those animals had no rebound. And they took a bunch of blood from those animals and tried to infect other animals and it didn't work. So this approach in this pretty, you could not design an easier to cure monkey than this monkey that had HIV, which is easy to cure, started on day 7, given for 2 years of ART. All right, so this is set up to succeed, but it did. And it suggested that in that setting, antibodies plus the TLR7 can be curative. Now, how that happened, no one knows. TR7 can activate CD4 cells and probably cause latency reversal. And perhaps by causing the virus to come out with those BNAbs around, you essentially eliminate the reservoir. But it's a nice combination approach. This is the study that I asked Rick about. This is the study by Mal Martin where he showed that, and a bunch of other people, where they showed that if you give antibodies during acute infection and allow the virus to rebound, you get post-rebound control from CD8 T cells, immune complex, and so forth. All right? The reason why I'm saying that is that Rowena Johnson and the AMFAR team, and they have a symposium here tomorrow about some of this stuff, have given us a really nice, sizable, generous grant to do a combination study that could actually work. And what we have designed is this, and we're in the process of trying to put everything together, is a study where, like I said, we're coming in, we're going to vaccinate people with a DNA vaccine that targets conserved areas. We're going to boost that with a full-length gag. And then we're going to boost it again with MVA, because apparently the vaccinologists have figured out that if you start with DNA and then go to MVA, you get really good CD T cell responses. So we're going to do that. And then this will generate T cells that are going to be good, but not sufficient. Then we're going to do this working with the Vaccine Research Center, which have been quite generous. We're going to try to combine some of their BNAbs, VRC07, perhaps with 101074, and a TLR9 agonist, similar to that study with Dan Baruch. Idea here being that we'll get some latency reversal from the TLR9 agonist. We'll get some reservoir reduction. We'll enhance the T cell responses. All good. And then we'll stop the therapy like was done in the study with Rick and Michelle Nuswag and Mal Martin. We'll stop therapy with being. I actually think what happens here, back in the drug resistance days, we observed that when people failed therapy, when they were undetectable and then they started to fail and that virus came up slowly, we observed, and we published a ton of papers on this, that in that context, we could detect high levels of HIV-specific T cells and a persistent reduction in the viral load set point, which in hindsight may be this immune complex story. But there's a robust literature showing this. And I always assumed what was happening was that treatment prevented the virus from shooting up. Treatment in that setting, drug resistance, allowed the virus to come up gently. So the immune system had time to do what it needed to do. And that may be, in fact, what will happen with these BNAbs. Who knows? This is a kitchen sink approach, I grant it. I think it's rationally designed. There's a massive black box. But I know what's going in, and I know what's going out, because we're going to do a treatment interruption and look at the viral load set point. Hopefully this will get done in my lifetime. Okay, I'd like to just thank my. So we have. How do we do our business? We have this amazing cohort that's run by Becky Ho up on the far right. And the team that you see here, and we basically just manage this cohort, and we get samples, and we distribute to anybody who wants them, and we never say no. And we use this as an infrastructure to do prospective clinical interventions. They're funded by the DARE Collaboratory, shown here. That's led by myself and Peter Hunt and Louis Picker and Sharon Lewin, as well as the Amphar Institute, which I mentioned earlier. Thank you very much.
Well, Steve, that was something else. So,
I'll take that as a compliment.
Yeah, it is a compliment. So how do you think these TLR ligands are working? What do you think the mechanism of this is? First, you've got two different ones. They each engage TLRs that are endosomal.
Yeah, but they're 7 and 9. They're pretty close.
Well, yeah, right. They recognize nucleic acids and everything. So how do you think they're affecting rebound? What do you think the mechanism is?
If you look carefully in the study that the Danish did, where they give the TLR9 agonists, these people were suppressed, and then they got the TLR9 agonists, and there was a lot of blipping and this and that. It wasn't a controlled study. But I actually think that these drugs are the most powerful latency reversing drugs that we have. TLR7 in monkeys, in one monkey at least, in one monkey study, did latency reversal. TLR9 in a human study. So I think you get latency reversal, and if you have BNAbs around, you get the reservoir lower. And that's a key part of elite control, is a low reservoir.
All right, so you think they're working primarily through reversal latency. So which cells are producing the latency reversal agent, or do you think it's a direct effect on T cells that don't seem to express that much of those TLRs? I don't know. I'm not trying to pin you down, but
he knows I know nothing about immunology, so he's trying to make me look like a fool. But I'm not falling for it.
No.
Type 1 interferons. Next.
All right. So you think it's an interferon effect?
What do I care? I'm a clinician. I don't really care how it happens. Something goes in, something comes out.
Hi, Dick.
Ron, yeah.
Okay, here we go. I loved your story on the patient treated early. I have two questions. The first is I think antibody levels could be informative. So do you know anything yet about the anti-HIV envelope levels in this individual when treatment was just started very early? Were they detectable?
No.
They were not. Did they increase at all over the 2 years of treatment?
No. But they did after they came up during the interruption, but they were weak, and they're now waiting to where he's now antibody negative.
Wow. Phew. Oof. My second question maybe then is becomes irrelevant. Is there any evidence that rebound might actually be a new infection from a different exposure?
Totally important. I mean, he had a lot of exposures in the beginning. So, no, Mary Kearney, who was a wonderful collaborator, was able to sequence both viruses, and they were the same. The one he had 2 years before, and that one. So, yeah. So, you had a question?
So, actually, I have two questions. The first one is, we know that HIV-positive patients have LPS in the bloodstream, and this is TLR4 agonist.
Yes.
So, and this is one of the major problem in HIV infection. So why TLR7 agonists would be different? And the second question is, you are proposing to use a vaccine DNA and a boost with MVA. And there is like a concern about using MVA in humans because there are a lot of people have pre-existing immune response to MVA. Are you planning to use other vector like adenovirus associated or something like that?
The first question about the TLR4 actually turned out to be a pathway associated with a good response in that monkey study, which is interesting. The reason why we're doing TLR7 and TLR9 is largely because the way that we've gotten to this. So Gilead developed TLR7 for some reason for hepatitis B, and didn't work there. But they had this asset, and they started doing these monkey studies, and it seems to work well. And it's been very empiric. Same with TLR9. And they've been reasonably safe.
Yeah, but the monkeys has like chronic immune activation as humans have.
Yeah?
Yeah, okay.
But so and the MVA question, it's my understanding is from all the studies done in people, again, I'm making this up. Rick, does pre-existing MVA blunt your response? Is it such a detrimental effect that you should screen for it?
So we did a study way back where we we looked at MVA responses in people who had smallpox vaccine, or people who hadn't had smallpox vaccine, and we gave MVA, and then we gave MVA again. And yes, MVA will blunt the response to MVA. Now, I don't actually know the answer to your question if you have evidence of MVA-specific responses, whether you'll blunt your response to the insert, but I'm assuming you will. But most people nowadays haven't had smallpox vaccine, so it shouldn't really be a problem in today's population.
Thank you.
I have another question, actually, Stephen. So do you have earlier lymph node biopsies from the Berlin patient few months or years after his treatment for the blood cancer, showing that collagen actually reduced over time?
No, that was so Timothy was cured in Berlin, and he showed up in our clinic about 5 years later, right? And so we basically don't have, so there was some tissue work that was done by Gerald Hooder and that crowd. I don't think they looked at that, but it's something one might want to think about looking at to see the time course.
Do you have any samples from patients treated for hematologic cancers, just showing if perhaps steroid could cause that kind of reduction in collagen?
That Tim and I never really followed up on that. And a good control would be whether or not transplantation or the immunotherapy could actually have the effect, which I was assuming was due to his cure. It's an anecdote, it's a hypothesis generating. We haven't pursued it, but that would be a good controlled study to do. Tim?
How long after the transplant was it when we sampled Tim Brown?
At least 5 to 7 years.
5 to 7 years. So in those tissues, we thought things looked pretty normal with respect to architecture, CD4 T cell count, collagen, things like that. When you look, and we just showed this at Croy, when you look at patients who are treated in acute infection, truly acute, Phoebig stage 1, by then, the degree of inflammatory damage to the lymph node is pretty profound already, and they've been viremic for about 10 days from the time of acquisition. And we've not found anything, any intervention, although we haven't done a lot, but we've never seen anything that causes a reversal of the inflammatory damage. I'm not talking about function, I'm just talking about the damage to the fibroblastic reticular cell network and things like that. The one exception is when you use an antifibrotic at the very earliest time, and this was in SIV infection. Jake Estes had a paper in JID a few years ago showing that if you give pirfenidone, a TGF-beta inhibitor, at the time of infection, that you can reduce the amount of fibrotic damage and maintain normal CD4 levels. Otherwise, we think it's pretty irreversible.
More questions? Thank you, Stephen.